The sun hung heavy over the valley floor on the 14th of October, a flat, oppressive disk that bleached the color out of the dried scrub brush and made the air shimmer with a deceptive, lingering heat. To the 30 families staking their claims in the dusty basin of Granite Creek, this unseasonal warmth was a blessing, a grace period that allowed them to drag timber from the tree line and hammer together the boxy, thin-walled cabins that signified civilization in the territory. They wiped sweat from their foreheads and spoke confidently of a mild winter, trusting the rhythm of the seasons they had known back east, where autumn faded gently into a polite and manageable snow. They measured their progress in board feet and visible structures, in the height of their false fronts and the straightness of their fences, believing that the geometry of a town was enough to hold back the wildness of the high country. But 300 yards up the northern slope, well above the designated plot lines of the township, a lone figure in a faded light pink prairie dress was waging a war against the geology itself. Lynn, a widow whose husband had been lost to the cholera crossing the plains, stood not with a hammer, but with a heavy, rusted pickaxe, swinging it with a rhythmic, grim determination into the side of the hill. She was a small woman, and the dress, once a delicate thing of lace and soft cotton, was now stained heavy with red clay and stiff with dust, its hem tattered where it dragged against the rough stones. She did not look down at the town, nor did she engage with the curious onlookers who occasionally rode up the incline to jeer or question her sanity. To the men of Granite Creek, she was a curiosity at best, and a madwoman at worst. A solitary figure rejecting the flat, easy land for a brutal excavation into the rock. Josiah, the town's unofficial mayor, and a man who placed great stock in the appearance of order, sat on his horse at the edge of her claim, shielding his eyes against the glare. He watched as Lynn heaved a wheelbarrow full of loose scree away from the mouth of the tunnel she was carving, her breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. "It's not right," Josiah muttered to Thomas, the town's lead carpenter, who sat atop his wagon beside him. "A woman alone, digging a grave in the side of a mountain while the rest of us build proper homes. It scares the children, Thomas. It looks desperate." Thomas, a man of angles and precise measurements, who prided himself on the speed at which he could frame a wall, spat into the dust and shook his head. "Let her dig, Josiah. When the ground freezes hard in a month, she'll be coming down to beg for a corner in a real house. Rock holds the cold. She's building an ice box, and she doesn't even know it." They did not understand that Lynn was not digging a grave, nor was she ignorant of the cold. She was reading the landscape with a literacy earned through generations of ancestors who had survived the bitter steppes of a land far from this one, a knowledge passed down in whispers and remembered in the muscle memory of survival. She knew that the heat of October was a lie, a predator waiting for the prey to lower its guard. While the townspeople built upward, exposing every face of their homes to the wind, Lynn was digging inward, seeking the stable, insulating embrace of the earth's thermal mass. She stopped only to drink from a tin canteen, her eyes scanning the horizon, where the blue sky was just beginning to bruise with a faint, imperceptible gray, the herald of a winter that would not be polite and would not be mild. The sound of the pickaxe became a constant, rhythmic heartbeat that echoed off the valley walls, continuing long after the sun had dipped below the peaks and the town below had settled into the quiet clinking of dinner plates and lantern light. Lynn worked by the glow of a single kerosene lamp, the flame casting long dancing shadows against the raw earth walls of her deepening sanctuary. She was not merely digging a hole. She was engineering a survival system, removing the hillside cubic foot by cubic foot to create a space where the temperature would remain constant, immune to the violent fluctuations of the outside air. The soil here was dense, a mixture of clay and packed gravel that held its shape well, but the labor required to move it was immense, a punishment on the body that left her hands blistered and her shoulders throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. Thomas rode up again 2 weeks later, his wagon loaded with fresh-cut pine planks, the smell of sap sharp and green in the cooling air. He pulled up short of her excavation, which had now evolved into a defined entryway reinforced with carefully stacked stones she had hauled by hand from the creek bed. "I have scrap lumber, Lynn," Thomas called out, his voice carrying a tone of condescending charity that grated against the silence of the hillside. "Enough to build you a lean-to, at least. Something to get you out of the dirt. You can't live in a cave like a bear. It's uncivilized." Lynn rested on her shovel, wiping a streak of mud from her cheek, the pink of her dress now almost entirely obscured by the brown and gray of her labor. "The wood will shrink when the dry air comes," she said, her voice raspy from the dust, but steady. "The wind will find the gaps. The earth does not shrink." Thomas laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement that seemed to startle his horses. "Wood has served men for 1,000 years. Woman. It breathes. It stands up to the snow. This," he gestured to the dark maw of her hillside home, "this is a tomb waiting to collapse." He rode away, shaking his head, convinced that her stubbornness was a form of hysteria brought on by grief. But Lynn did not watch him go. She turned back to the rear wall of her dwelling, where she was carefully carving out a ventilation shaft that angled upward, a crucial lung for the home that would allow stale air to escape without sacrificing the precious heat she would soon need to hoard. She knew the physics of the airflow as intuitively as she knew the weight of the stone. Hot air rises, cold air sinks, and a fire burning deep in the earth needs a breath to keep from suffocating its maker. She spent the next 10 days moving tons of rock, building a thermal bank along the back wall where the sun, low in the southern sky, would strike during the daylight hours. She smoothed the floor with river clay and water, packing it down until it was as hard as fired brick. The town below grew taller, the skeletons of barns and the steeples of the church rising in triumphant silhouettes against the sunset, a testament to human industry and optimism. They had glass windows shipped from the railhead, thin, fragile panes that rattled in their frames when the evening breeze picked up. Lynn had no glass. Instead, she fashioned a small, heavy door from thick slabs of oak she had salvaged from a lightning-struck tree, fitting it with leather hinges that she greased with tallow to prevent freezing. She was not building for a view. She was building for a siege. By the middle of November, the deception of the autumn heat finally broke, snapping with a violence that sent the first shockwave of dread through the valley. The sky turned a churning, bruised purple, and the wind shifted, coming down from the peaks not as a breeze, but as a physical weight, carrying the metallic scent of ozone and ice. The birds had vanished days ago, a sign the townspeople had been too busy hammering to notice, but Lynn had seen them go, watching the geese V formation dissolve into the south with a desperate urgency. In the town square, an old fur trapper named Miller, who had come down from the High Line to trade pelts for flour, stood by the general store spitting tobacco juice into the dust, his eyes narrowed at the horizon. "She's turning," Miller warned anyone who would listen, his voice a gravelly rumble. "This ain't a snow, this is a killing frost. You boys better have your chinking tight." Sarah, the owner of the mercantile, and perhaps the only soul in Granite Creek who looked at Lynn with something approaching pity rather than disdain, took the warning to heart. She drove her small buggy up the winding track to Lynn's hillside claim, the wheels bouncing over the hardening ruts. She found Lynn arranging flat stones around a small, efficient fire pit she had dug into the floor of the dugout, the chimney flue drawing the smoke up and out through the hidden vent in the slope above. "Lynn," Sarah said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the wind whipped her hair across her face, "the temperature is dropping fast. Miller says it could hit 20 below by morning. You can't stay up here. My stockroom has a stove. It's warm. It's safe." Lynn looked up, her face smeared with soot, her pink dress now a heavy, layered armor of dirt and patched fabric. She did not look afraid. She looked ready. "The wind will hit the valley floor hardest," Lynn said softly, her English accented but clear. It will accelerate through the gap. Your stove will burn hot, but the walls will stay cold. Here the earth is 50 degrees, always. I only need to warm the air a little. Sarah looked at the dark, low ceiling of the dugout, the way the walls seemed to close in, and shuddered. It felt like a cellar, damp and heavy. It's not right to be alone in the dark, Sarah pressed, reaching out a gloved hand. Please, for your own sake. Lynn stepped back gently, declining the touch. I am not in the dark, she said. I am in the mountain. Go down, Sarah. Cover your windows with blankets. Do not trust the glass. Sarah left, her heart heavy with the certainty that she would find the Chinese widow frozen to death when the storm broke. As she descended, she saw the townspeople scrambling, finally sensing the change in the air. Men were chopping wood frantically, piling logs high against their thin walls, trying to build barriers against a cold they could already feel seeping through their coats. The optimism of October had evaporated, replaced by a frenetic, belated panic. Lynn watched them from her doorway, a small, motionless figure framed by the earth, before she stepped inside and pulled the heavy oak door shut, sealing it with a thick beam. She lit a single lantern, the golden light reflecting off the thermal mass of the stone walls, and waited. The silence inside the hill was absolute, a stark contrast to the rising howl of the wind outside that was beginning to strip the leaves from the trees. The drop happened just after midnight, a sudden, brutal plunge that defied all the gentle winters the settlers had known in the east. The temperature didn't just fall, it crashed, plummeting from 30 degrees to 15, then to 0, then to 10 below, all within the span of 4 hours. In the valley, the effect was catastrophic. The green timber Thomas had used to frame the houses, still holding moisture from the sap, began to freeze and contract violently. Loud cracks like pistol shots echoed through the town as structural beams twisted and shrank, pulling away from the nails that held them. The chinking between the logs, hastily applied and not yet cured, crumbled and fell away, opening hundreds of tiny fissures that allowed the wind to scream into the living spaces of the terrified families. Inside the houses, the stoves were roaring, glowing cherry red as men shoveled coal and wood into the fireboxes until the metal groaned. But it was a losing battle. The physics of the uninsulated wooden boxes could not contend with the differential between the fire and the freezing void outside. A few feet from the stoves, the air was freezing. Water left in basins turned to solid blocks of ice within minutes. Children huddled under piles of quilts, seeing their breath mist in the air of their own bedrooms. In the grandest house of the town, Josiah paced the floor in his heavy coat, watching the frost creep up the inside of his expensive glass windows in fern-like patterns that grew thicker by the second. "It will pass," he told his wife, his voice shaking. "It's a freak snap. It will break by dawn." Up on the hillside, Lynn sat on a woven mat near her small fire. The temperature inside the dugout was not hot, but it was steady, a consistent, livable 55 degrees. The massive thermal inertia of the thousands of tons of dirt above and around her acted as a battery, holding the earth's natural warmth and releasing it slowly. She did not need a roaring blaze. She needed only a small cluster of coals to nudge the temperature up to comfort. She boiled water for tea, the steam rising straight up to the vent, the draft perfect and smoke-free. She could hear the wind outside, a distant, muffled roaring that sounded like a train passing miles away, but the flame of her lantern did not flicker. The earth did not shrink. The earth did not crack. She took a sip of the bitter, hot tea and touched the wall beside her. It was cool, but dry. She was not fighting the storm. She had simply stepped out of its way. Dawn brought no relief, only a gray, blinding fury that erased the world. The blizzard that Miller had predicted arrived with the force of a solid object, a white wall of driving snow and ice crystals moving at 60 miles an hour. Visibility in the town dropped to zero. A man could not see his own hand if he extended it beyond the porch railing. The snow did not fall. It was driven horizontally, scouring the paint from the wood and packing into every microscopic gap in the cabins. The town of Granite Creek was being buried, not slowly, but violently. Drifts piled up against the windward sides of the buildings, reaching the roof lines in hours, the weight of the snow pressing against the groaning timber frames. Josiah's house, standing proud and tall on the main street, took the brunt of the assault. The wind hammered the flat surfaces of his walls, driving the cold through the wood until the nails on the inside walls frosted over white. He and his family had retreated to the kitchen, the smallest room, hanging blankets over the doorways to trap the heat, but the drafts were relentless. The fire devoured wood at an unsustainable rate, and the woodpile was outside, buried under 5 feet of drift. "We have to go out," he shouted to Thomas, who had stumbled over from next door, his face white with frostbite just from crossing the yard. "We need more fuel." Thomas shook his head, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "You can't go out there, Josiah. You'll be lost in 10 feet. The rope. We need a rope to the shed." But even with a rope, the task was deadly. The wind chill was 45 degrees below zero, a temperature that froze exposed flesh in seconds. They were prisoners in their own homes, trapped in structures that were failing them. The realization began to dawn on them, a cold dread heavier than the storm itself. They had built for a world that did not exist here. They had built for looks, for pride, for the memories of a softer land, and now the land was taking its payment. In the midst of the howling chaos, Sarah, huddled in the back of her store wrapped in buffalo robes, found her thoughts drifting to the hillside. She imagined the fragile woman in the pink dress, surely dead by now, buried under the white avalanche that was consuming the valley. She wept, not just for the cold, but for the cruelty of a world that would extinguish such a strange, brave little light. But 300 yards up, the snow blew over the curve of the hill. It did not drift against a flat wall, because there was no wall. The wind accelerated over the smooth, frozen slope of Lynn's roof, scouring it clean, leaving the ventilation shaft clear. Underneath the screaming white void, the kettle began to whistle, a high, domestic sound that no one else could hear. Lynn opened a small sack of dried meat, portioning out her meal with calm, deliberate movements. She checked the heavy oak beam across her door, feeling the vibration of the storm against the wood, a savage beast scratching to get in. She placed her hand flat against the door. "Not today," she whispered. "Not today." The pink dress, clean of dust now that the digging was done, reflected the warm glow of the lantern. She picked up a piece of charcoal and made a single mark on the stone wall, counting the first day of the siege. She had food for 3 months. She had oil for 4. She was the only person in Granite Creek who was not afraid. By the 4th day, the silence inside the cabins of Granite Creek was more terrifying than the wind. The roaring stoves had gone quiet in all but the wealthiest homes, the stockpiles of chopped wood exhausted by the ravenous appetite of the uninsulated walls. Families had begun to burn their furniture, feeding heirloom dining chairs and handcrafted cradles into the iron bellies of the stoves, trading their pasts for another hour of warmth. But the cold was a relentless, creeping fluid. It found the gaps where the green timber had shrunk, whistling through the chinking with a sound like a thin, dying breath. Inside Thomas's home, the frost line had moved from the windows to the floorboards, crawling inward until only a 3-foot circle around the dying stove remained habitable. He sat wrapped in 3 wool blankets, staring at the frost forming on the nails of his own walls, metal conduits that piped the sub-zero temperatures directly into the room, spotting the interior wood with white heads of ice. Thomas, the man who knew the tensile strength of pine and the load-bearing capacity of oak, was watching his understanding of the world fail in real time. He realized with a sick, sinking feeling that he had built structures designed to shed rain, not to repel a siege of temperature. The thin walls had no thermal mass. They held heat only as long as the fire roared, and the moment the flames died, the house became exactly as cold as the blizzard outside. He looked at his wife and son, huddled together and shivering violently, their skin taking on a waxen gray pallor. The thermometer on the porch, before it had been buried, had read 45 degrees below zero. At that temperature, hope was a mathematical impossibility without a change in tactics. "We cannot stay," Thomas whispered, his lips cracking as he spoke. "If we sleep here tonight, we won't wake up." Josiah, 3 houses down, had reached the same conclusion, though it had cost him his piano to delay it. He had burned the instrument piece by piece, the polished mahogany offering a brief, frantic heat before turning to ash. Now, standing in the wreckage of his parlor, he saw the truth that Lynn had tried to tell him. His house was a cage of freezing air. He wrapped his face in a scarf, grabbed a lantern that was sloshing with the last dregs of oil, and forced his front door open. The snow was packed hard, a solid wall that he had to kick away, tumbling into the drifts that reached his chest. He didn't look for the road. The road was gone. He looked up. Through the swirling white madness, a faint, impossible scent drifted down from the hillside. Not the smell of pine smoke, which dissipated instantly in the wind, but the heavy, grounded smell of burning coal and slow-cooked earth. It was the smell of stability. The exodus began not as a coordinated march, but as a desperate, staggering chain of survivors realizing there was only one high ground left. Sarah, the mercantile owner, was the first to break trail, her buffalo robes heavy with ice, clutching a rope she had tied around her waist to pull her 2 young daughters. They moved with agonizing slowness, sinking to their hips in the snow, the wind screaming continuously, a physical force that tried to push them back down into the valley of dead timber. Every step was a battle against the physics of the storm. The incline that had seemed so minor in October now felt like the face of a cliff. Josiah and Thomas found them halfway up, the men's strength sapped by days of shivering, their pride stripped away by the sheer brutality of the cold. They joined the line, heads down, no one speaking, for to open one's mouth was to risk freezing the lungs. They navigated by the terrain alone, the familiar landmarks of the town buried under 6 feet of white drifts. The only guide was the slope itself and the faint, rhythmic venting of smoke from the hillside, which the wind snatched away almost immediately. Thomas, his hands numb inside his gloves, fell twice, his body screaming to simply lie down in the soft, beckoning snow and sleep. It was the deadly seduction of hypothermia, the body's final surrender. But then he saw it, a dark, recessed eye in the white face of the hill. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a grand facade. It was a hole, reinforced with ugly, jagged stones, half buried but undeniably open. A tunnel. The entrance to the grave they had mocked. Sarah reached the heavy oak door first, her knuckles rapping feebly against the wood. There was no delay, no suspicious peering through a curtain. The bar inside slid back with a heavy thud, and the door swung inward. Lynn stood there, framed by the golden light of the kerosene lamp, her pink prairie dress vibrant against the brown earthen walls. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a gatekeeper. She didn't say a word, didn't waste breath on "I told you so" or "you are late." She simply stepped aside, her small hand gripping the iron handle of the door, and ushered the freezing, terrified group into the womb of the mountain. As Josiah stumbled over the threshold, pulling his wife behind him, the silence hit him first. The screaming wind was instantly cut off, replaced by a thick, muffled quiet that felt holy. The transition from the exterior chaos to the interior of the dugout was a shock to the system so profound that Thomas nearly fainted. It wasn't hot inside. The thermometer hanging on a root that poked through the ceiling read 55 degrees, but compared to the 40 below hellscape outside, it felt tropical. The air was still. It didn't move. It didn't draft. It sat heavy and dry, warmed by the thermal mass of the earth that Lynn had so painstakingly preserved. The survivors, 15 of them in total who had made the climb, collapsed onto the hard-packed clay floor, gasping in the thick, earthy air. They stripped off their frozen outer layers, the ice on their coats beginning to melt immediately, dripping onto the floor where the dry clay drank it up greedily. Lynn moved among them with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. She had expected this. In the corner, stacked neatly against the curved earthen wall, were piles of cured furs and wool blankets she had traded for or salvaged, far more than one woman needed. She handed them out without ceremony. On the small recessed stove, a marvel of engineering that sat almost flush with the wall to maximize heat radiation, a large iron pot bubbled. She ladled out broth, thick with root vegetables she had stored in the cool, dark recesses of the back wall. "Drink slowly," she commanded, her voice quiet but filling the small space effortlessly. "The stomach is shocked. Warm it gently." Josiah sat with his back against the wall, his hands shaking as he held the tin cup. He touched the dirt behind him. It wasn't cold. It was the temperature of the deep earth, a constant, unyielding 50 degrees that didn't care about the storm. He looked at the ceiling, supported by arched stone ribs and timber shoring that Thomas recognized instantly as superior bracing work. There were no nails to freeze, no thin planks to warp. The entire hillside was the insulation. "You knew," Josiah croaked, his voice raw. "You knew the wood would fail." Lynn didn't look up from the pot. "The wood is for the summer," she said simply. "The earth is for the winter. The badger knows this. The bear knows this. Only men forget." For 6 days the storm raged on, burying Granite Creek completely. Inside the hill, time dissolved into a routine of survival and instruction. The space was tight, forcing the former grandees of the town to sit knee to knee with the woman they had shunned. Thomas, his carpenter's eye now wide open, spent hours studying the ventilation shaft Lynn had carved. He watched the smoke rise in a perfect lazy spiral, drawn out by the pressure differential she had calculated by feel. He realized that while he had been building boxes, she had been building a machine. "The intake?" Thomas asked on the third day, pointing to a small screened pipe near the floor. "It draws from the snowpack?" "From the brush line," Lynn corrected, mending a tear in her dress by the lantern light. "The air under the snow is warmer than the air in the wind. I pull from the blanket, not the storm." Thomas lowered his head, humbled. It was a principle of fluid dynamics he had never considered, applied with materials that cost nothing. The skeptics were stripped of their authority here. Josiah's mayoral title meant nothing when the currency was caloric retention and airflow. They were alive only because of the charity of the mad woman. The pink dress, once a symbol of her impracticality in their eyes, now seemed like a banner of defiance. She kept it clean, despite the dirt floor, a signal of discipline that shamed their own disheveled states. The dynamic of the group shifted. Fear gave way to a reverent curiosity. They watched how she banked the coals at night, covering them with ash to keep the heat releasing slowly without consuming fuel. They watched how she managed moisture, wiping down the few cool spots near the door to prevent mold, maintaining the microclimate with the obsession of a captain on a submarine. "We built fast," Sarah whispered one evening, the wind howling muffled and distant above their heads. "We wanted it to look like a city. We wanted it to look like home." Lynn nodded, her eyes dark and unreadable. "You built for the eye," she said. "The mountain does not see. The mountain only feels weight and temperature. You must build for the truth of the place, not the memory of another place." When the silence finally returned to the outside world, it was deafening. The wind stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving a vacuum of sound that woke them all. Lynn was the first to the door. She had to dig her way out, using a short-handled spade to bore a tunnel through the drift that had completely covered the entrance. Sunlight, blinding and sharp, spilled into the dugout, causing the survivors to squint and shield their eyes. One by one, they crawled out of the tunnel and stood on the hillside, looking down into the valley. Granite Creek was gone. In its place was a sea of undulating white drifts, broken only by the jagged, broken skeletons of roofs and the occasional chimney standing like a tombstone. The wooden structures had been crushed by the weight of the snow or blown apart by the freezing contraction of the timber. It was a ruin, a total erasure of their efforts. Josiah fell to his knees, weeping not for the loss of his property, but for the sheer folly of it all. He saw the wreckage of his grand house, the roof caved in, the walls splayed out like a broken crate. But as they looked back at the hill, Lynn's home remained. It was invisible save for the dark hole of the door and the thin wisp of smoke rising from the snow, breathing steadily. It hadn't fought the storm, it had let the storm pass over it. The lesson was etched into the landscape in violent contrast, the fragile arrogance of the imported architecture versus the resilient humility of the native design. In the weeks that followed, the thaw came slowly. The survivors did not rebuild the town as it was. Under Thomas's direction and Lynn's quiet supervision, they began to dig. They harvested the stone from the creek and the clay from the riverbank. They built into the slopes, using the shattered timbers of their old lives only for bracing and frontage. They abandoned the thin, high walls of the east for the thick, low profiles of the high country. They learned to value the thermal mass over the square footage, the orientation to the sun over the orientation to the street. Lynn remained in her dugout, the pink dress fading but enduring, a silent matriarch to a new kind of settlement, one that stopped fighting the land and started listening to it. The mad woman's hole became the blueprint for their survival, a permanent reminder that wisdom often wears the clothes of foolishness until the storm strips the world bare.